The second hand on the wall clock clicked into place, and I said the words I'd said hundreds of times before. Time of death, midnight. The room was quiet in that way that only happens after something irreversible has already occurred. I'm a 43-year-old doctor, and I work nights at a hospice. Death is not unusual here. It's expected. It's scheduled around. It's documented, signed, confirmed, and quietly absorbed into the next shift report. There is a protocol for everything, including what happens when a human being takes their last breath. I followed it without hesitation. I checked for a pulse. I listened for breath sounds. I noted the time. I closed the chart. Then I heard a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was a soft electronic click, like a system waking up when it shouldn't. I stood there for a second longer than necessary, my hands still resting on the bed rail, my eyes fixed on a patient who was no longer alive. Hospice work is different from hospital medicine. In a hospital, doctors fight death. In hospice, we prepare for it. We manage pain. We manage fear. We sit in silence when there's nothing left to fix. We don't expect surprises after the moment of death. That part is supposed to be final. I've worked at Willow Creek Hospice House for 8 years. It's a small facility on the edge of Bend, Oregon. 12 private rooms, soft lighting, wide hallways, no alarms screaming unless something truly urgent happens. Families like it because it doesn't feel like a hospital. Staff like it because things usually make sense here. I usually take the night shift. Fewer visitors, fewer conversations, fewer opinions about what should or shouldn't be done. At night, the work becomes simple. Comfort meds, repositioning, sitting with patients who don't want to be alone with their thoughts. I've always been good at that part. The woman in front of me was Rosemary Klein, 71 years old. Neurological disease that slowly shut down her body while leaving her mind painfully intact. She'd arrived a few days earlier, already weak, already tired, already aware of what was coming. She died exactly the way we expected her to. Quietly, no distress, no panic, no last-minute emergencies. I stepped back from the bed and reached for the call panel to reset the room. That's when the sound came again, a short vibration faint enough that I almost dismissed it as something in the hallway. Then I realized it was coming from the bedside table. Rosemary's phone lit up. For a moment, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Phones do that sometimes. Screens light up for notifications, emergency alerts, low battery warnings. I told myself that's all it was. My body, however, didn't buy that explanation. My shoulders tightened and my stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with medicine. The phone vibrated once more and went dark. I stood there longer than I should have. Doctors aren't supposed to hesitate over electronics. We're trained to troubleshoot, to explain, to move on. I reminded myself that death messes with perception. Exhaustion makes people notice things they normally wouldn't. I reset the room, documented everything, and left. In the hallway, the lights hummed softly. The nurse's station was empty. The building had settled into its usual overnight rhythm. I told myself the moment had passed. Before I continue, if you've ever worked in a hospital or a hospice, or if you've had an experience you still can't explain, leave a comment on this video. And if you want to hear real doctors and nurses stories like this one, make sure you subscribe. These are the stories most people in medicine don't talk about. I went back to my routine. Medication checks, chart reviews, quiet footsteps past closed doors. Around 1 a.m, I passed Rosemary's room again. Everything looked normal. The bed was still. The room was dark. No sounds, no lights. By the time my shift ended, I had convinced myself the phone incident was nothing, a glitch, a coincidence, something that only felt strange because of the timing. I drove home, slept for a few hours, and returned the next night. Night shifts blur together in hospice. Different patients, same silence. That second night, I didn't think about Rosemary much. Her room had already been cleaned. Her chart was closed. Her name had moved into the section reserved for completed cases. Just before midnight, my personal phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, annoyed at myself for forgetting to silence it. The screen showed an incoming call. The number wasn't saved in my contacts, but it looked familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. I answered without speaking. There was nothing on the line, no voice, no background noise, just an open connection that lasted long enough for me to say hello twice before it disconnected. I stared at the screen after the call ended. No voicemail, no missed call notification, just a timestamp. I stood in the middle of the hallway, listening to the building breathe around me, trying to come up with a reasonable explanation that didn't sound ridiculous even inside my own head. This was a hospice. People died here every week. Phones rang all the time. There was no reason to connect those facts. Still, I checked the number once more before putting the phone away. It matched the one listed in Rosemary's chart. I told myself that didn't mean anything. I stood there with the phone still warm in my hand, the screen already dark, my thumb hovering as if it might ring again if I touched it wrong. I didn't move right away. I listened, not to the phone but to the building, the low hum of the HVAC, a cart rolling somewhere far down the hall, a cough behind a closed door. Everything sounded normal, which somehow made the call feel less real and more intrusive at the same time. I slid the phone into my pocket and forced myself to take one steady breath before moving on. Rosemary had asked earlier that night if I believed people lingered after death, not as ghosts, but as unfinished thoughts. I'd given her the standard answer, the one doctors give when honesty and comfort need to share the same sentence. I told her people live on in memory, in habits, in the small ways they change the people around them. She nodded, satisfied in a way that made me uneasy, like she'd filed the information away for later use. It wasn't the kind of question patients usually asked out loud, especially not when they were this close to the end. I didn't always work hospice. I spent years in emergency rooms where the goal was simple: keep the body going at all costs. I was good at it fast. Decisions, steady hands, shutting down emotions until the shift ended. What wore me down wasn't the blood or the chaos. It was the families who wanted miracles after medicine had already given them the truth. Hospice felt honest by comparison, quieter, less performative. It wasn't about saving lives. It was about not lying to people. That mattered more to me than I expected, especially after what I'd seen before in medicine. At night, Willow Creek settled into something like neutrality. Machines stayed on, but no one argued with them. Hallway lights dimmed automatically. Staff spoke in low voices without being told. The building wasn't asleep, just attentive. I trusted places like that. They didn't pretend death was dramatic or meaningful. They treated it like a fact, something that required care, but not commentary. That trust was why the call bothered me more than it should have. It didn't fit the rhythm I relied on to function at night, and I hated noticing that. Because noticing things usually leads to answers, eventually. My pocket buzzed again later that shift, not loudly, just enough to register against my leg. I didn't reach for it right away. I waited until the vibration stopped, then counted to 3 before checking the screen. The number stared back at me like an unfinished sentence. I didn't say the patient's name out loud. I didn't need to. Recognition doesn't require permission. I answered this time mostly because not answering felt worse. Silence filled the line in a way that made me hold my breath. I ended the call and kept walking, like that explained anything. It didn't. Really, I told myself exhaustion creates patterns where none exist. Doctors do this for survival. If we questioned every coincidence, we'd never make it through a shift. I washed my hands, checked another patient, adjusted a drip, signed a note. Normal actions are powerful when you're trying to convince yourself you're still in control. Control matters more at night when there are fewer people to correct you and fewer distractions from your own thoughts. I finished the shift without telling anyone what had happened. That choice felt practical at the time. It would matter later, in ways I didn't anticipate yet. Rosemary had talked about forgetting the way other patients talk about pain, calmly, precisely, as if it were a symptom you could rate on a scale. She didn't ask for reassurance. She asked for confirmation. That distinction stayed with me as the night went on, pressing against the rational explanations I kept lining up. I hadn't thought much about what that fear might look like after death. I assumed, like most people, that it simply stopped. That assumption felt less solid than it used to, especially standing alone in a quiet hallway, with a phone in my pocket, still vibrating. I checked the number one more time before putting the phone away, not because I expected clarity, but because avoiding it felt dishonest. It matched the chart. That fact sat there unhelpful and heavy, and I took a breath and walked toward the nurse's station, already deciding what not to write down, what to keep to myself, and how much attention I could afford to give a thing that didn't fit. Somewhere down the hall, a call light clicked. I turned without thinking. That was the job after all. And the night wasn't finished with me. It rarely ever is. Here, I stepped into another room and focused on the person who needed me now, adjusting pillows, checking comfort, listening to breathing that was still steady, still present. Work has a way of narrowing your vision when you let it. For a while it worked. The phone stayed quiet. The minutes passed. I let myself believe the earlier call was done, filed away like so many strange things medicine never explains. I didn't check the time. I didn't want to know how close it was to midnight. The building stayed quiet. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't, not entirely, anymore. When my phone vibrated again, I didn't flinch. That surprised me. I didn't answer either. I watched the screen until it stopped, memorizing the timing, the length, the way it felt to ignore it. Choices matter in medicine, even small ones, especially small ones. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and kept moving, aware that I'd just made a decision I wouldn't be able to undo. The hallway lights dimmed a fraction, right on schedule. I checked the nearest door and stepped inside. Someone was calling for help, and I was still on duty. That mattered now. More. I checked the monitor before I looked at her face. That was habit drilled into me from years of hospital work, even though hospice monitors are more suggestion than authority. The numbers were drifting, not alarming yet, just loosening their grip. Rosemary's breathing had changed again. The pauses between breaths were longer now, uneven, like her body was forgetting the rhythm it had followed all day. I glanced at the clock on the wall without meaning to. 11:47 p.m. I adjusted the head of the bed and placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. She didn't respond. That wasn't new. Over the last hour, she'd slipped in and out of awareness, her eyes fluttering open only long enough to recognize the room before closing again. There was no panic in her face, no tension in her hands. Her body was doing what bodies do at the end. Slowly, methodically, without drama, I stepped out into the hallway to make a call I already knew wouldn't be answered. Michael's number rang until it rolled to voicemail. I left a message I'd left too many times before keeping my voice calm, measured, neutral. I told him his mother was declining and that it would be best if he came in. I didn't say the word now, but it was implied. I ended the call and stood there for a second longer than necessary, staring at the phone like it might change its mind and ring back. It didn't. Back in the room, Rosemary's breathing slowed again. The silence between breaths stretched long enough that I found myself counting without realizing it. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then a shallow inhale, barely enough to move her chest. This was familiar territory. I'd seen it hundreds of times. Knowing what's coming doesn't make it easier, it just makes it quieter. I pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down. Hospice doesn't rush death. We don't crowd it with equipment or chatter. We stay. Presence is part of the job description, even if no one writes it down. I spoke softly, not because I expected her to hear me, but because silence can feel heavy in moments like this. I told her she wasn't alone, that everything was taken care of, that her son had been called. These were facts, not promises. Facts are safer at the end. The clock ticked toward midnight. The building settled into its deepest quiet, that thin slice of night when even machines seemed to pause. At 11:59, her breathing stopped for what felt like a full minute. I leaned forward, watching her chest, my fingers resting lightly at her wrist. Nothing. Then, just as my mind shifted toward confirmation, one final breath slipped out slower than the others, like a release rather than an effort. After that, there was nothing. No inhale followed, no correction, just stillness. I waited. That's another thing you learn with experience. You don't rush the moment. You give the body time to prove itself. When it didn't, I checked for a pulse, listened at her chest, watched her face for any sign of movement. There was none. I glanced at the clock again. Midnight, exactly. Time of death, 12:00. I said it quietly out of habit, more than necessity. There was no one else in the room. I wrote it down, signed my name, closed the chart. The administrative part of death is efficient. It has to be. Paperwork doesn't grieve. I stood there for a few seconds after everything was finished, my hands still resting on the bed rail, my eyes fixed on a woman who no longer needed anything from me. That was when the room changed. It wasn't dramatic. No lights flickered, no alarm sounded. There was just a faint electronic click, subtle enough that I almost missed it. The kind of sound you only notice when you're already listening too closely. I turned my head toward the wall panel, thinking maybe I'd brushed it with my sleeve. The screen was dark, reset, normal. Then I heard it again. This time I knew where it was coming from. The bedside table, a low vibration, brief and contained, like something trying to get attention without making a scene. Rosemary's phone, face down where she'd left it earlier, glowed softly for a second before going still. I didn't move right away. My mind went through the usual list. Low battery, notification delay, some final automated process finishing itself. Phones do strange things when they're dying. So do people. I told myself that and reached for the device anyway, more out of professional instinct than curiosity. The screen was dark, no missed call, no alert, nothing to explain why it had moved at all. I set it back where it was and took a step away from the bed. The air in the room felt unchanged. No heaviness, no pressure, just the ordinary quiet that follows the end of a life. I finished the post-death checklist, adjusted the sheets, positioned her hands the way families prefer. This part of the job is intimate but not emotional. You focus on respect, on order, on making sure the last image someone sees is peaceful. When I stepped into the hallway, the lights hummed at their usual level. A nurse passed me with a clipboard and nodded. Nothing about the building suggested anything unusual had happened beyond what happens every week. That helped, or it should have. I called Michael again. This time it went straight to voicemail. I left another message, keeping my tone even, explaining that his mother had passed peacefully. I didn't mention the phone. I didn't mention the timing. There was no reason to add details that didn't belong in that conversation. I ended the call and slipped my phone into my pocket, suddenly aware of its weight in a way I hadn't been before. I went back to my duties. There were other patients, other needs. Midnight doesn't pause a hospice. It just marks a transition. I checked medications, documented vitals, answered a call light down the hall. Each task grounded me a little more. Normalcy is reassuring when you let it be. An hour later, as I walked past Rosemary's room again, I glanced inside without thinking. The bed was still. The room was dark. The phone lay exactly where I'd left it. Nothing moved. Nothing sounded. I told myself the earlier vibration was just that, an electrical hiccup at an inconvenient moment. Timing can make anything feel significant if you let it. I finished my shift without incident. By the time I drove home, the sky was already lightening at the edges. Morning has a way of shrinking the things that felt enormous at night. I slept woke and returned the following evening with the same routine, the same expectations, and the quiet assumption that whatever I'd noticed after midnight belonged to that room and that moment alone. Just before the clock reached 12 again, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I stopped walking mid-step, my shoe half lifted off the floor, the vibration still echoing against my thigh. The hallway clock said 11:58 p.m., not midnight. Close, but not enough to feel coincidental in a comforting way. I pulled the phone out slowly, like moving too fast might make the screen show something worse than it already was. The number wasn't saved, but I recognized it immediately. Recognition doesn't always come from memory. Sometimes it comes from context. I'd seen that sequence of digits less than 24 hours earlier printed neatly at the top of a closed chart. I didn't answer right away. Hospice teaches you patience. You wait for pain meds to work. You wait for families to arrive. You wait for bodies to finish what they've started. I waited for the phone to stop ringing on its own. It didn't. The vibration continued steady and polite, like it expected a response. I answered without saying anything. There was no voice, no static, no accidental pocket noise, just an open line. I listened harder than I should have, straining for something recognizable. After a few seconds, I said hello. My voice sounded normal. That bothered me more than silence. I said it again, louder this time, as if volume might trigger a reply. Nothing. The call disconnected on its own. I stared at the screen until it went dark. I told myself exactly what I would have told any colleague who came to me with the same story. Phones recycle numbers. Calls misroute. Technology fails in boring, inconvenient ways all the time. People only notice when timing gives it meaning. I put the phone back into my pocket and forced myself to keep moving. Standing still in a hospital hallway at night invites thoughts that don't help anyone. The next hour passed without incident. I checked medications, documented comfort levels, and spoke quietly with a patient who couldn't sleep. When you're busy, your mind behaves. When you're not, it wanders. I stayed busy on purpose. At 12:17 a.m., the phone buzzed again. This time I didn't hesitate. I answered immediately, my thumb pressing the screen with more force than necessary. Silence met me on the other end, identical to before. I didn't speak. I counted instead. 5 seconds, 10, 15. The line stayed open, empty, but present, like someone listening without breathing. Then it disconnected. I checked the call duration. 19 seconds. I stood there, my back against the wall, aware of how ridiculous I would sound if I said any of this out loud. Doctors aren't supposed to be rattled by phones. We deal with worse. Blood, grief, anger, blame. A silent call shouldn't register as anything more than an annoyance. And yet my heart was beating faster than it needed to. I tried calling the number back. It rang 3 times before going to voicemail. A generic recording answered. No name, no identifying message, just a polite prompt asking me to leave one. I didn't. I hung up and slipped the phone away, suddenly aware of how loud it felt in my pocket. By the end of the shift, I had a headache that had nothing to do with dehydration or sleep deprivation. It was the kind that comes from thinking too hard about something you don't want to acknowledge. I drove home with the radio on low, letting someone else's voice fill the space my thoughts kept circling. I slept poorly that day. Not because I was afraid, but because my brain wouldn't settle on a single explanation long enough to be satisfied. Every rational possibility dissolved under its own weight. Still, by the time I returned to work the following night, daylight had done its job. Things that survive the sun are usually worth worrying about. Everything else fades. The phone stayed quiet for most of the evening. I almost forgot about it. Almost. At 11:42 p.m., it rang again. I was in the medication room counting pills under fluorescent lights that made everything look too sharp. The sound startled me enough that I dropped the cup I was holding, tablets scattered across the counter. I stared at them for a second before answering, irritation edging out caution. Hello. Silence. I didn't ask who it was. I didn't say anything else. I listened. For the first few seconds, there was nothing. Then faintly, so faintly, I wondered if my mind was filling in gaps. I heard something that wasn't silence. A low, uneven sound. Not a voice, not static. It was rhythmic, but not steady. Breathing. I pulled the phone away from my ear and looked at it like the screen might explain what I was hearing. The sound continued slow and irregular, familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten. I'd heard that pattern hundreds of times, in hospital rooms, in hospice beds, in moments when the body is no longer negotiating. I ended the call. The medication room felt smaller than it had a minute earlier. I leaned against the counter and took a breath of my own, suddenly very aware of the difference between my lungs and whatever I'd just heard. I told myself it could have been background noise, someone else on the line, a misdial routed through a system that picked up ambient sound. That explanation sounded thin even to me. I checked the number again. Same one. Same as before. I didn't document the call. There's no place in a medical chart for something like that. I finished my medication rounds and kept my voice even when I spoke to patients. No one noticed anything different. That mattered. It meant I was still functioning. Around 1 a.m, I passed the nurse's station and caught my reflection in the darkened computer screen. I looked tired but not alarmed. I took that as a good sign. Fear leaves marks. This hadn't yet. My phone stayed quiet for the rest of the shift. When morning came, I felt almost foolish for how much attention I'd given it. 2 silent calls and a sound I couldn't prove I'd heard. That was nothing. People imagine worse things under better circumstances every day. The next night, the call came earlier, 11:31 p.m. I was walking down the same hallway I'd walked 100 times before, the one that led past Rosemary's old room. I stopped without meaning to, my body reacting, before my thoughts caught up. The phone buzzed in my hand, not loudly, just enough to demand acknowledgement. I answered. This time I didn't hear breathing. I heard a word. It wasn't clear. It wasn't loud. It barely qualified as speech, just a sound shaped enough to recognize pressed through a line that didn't want to carry it. One syllable stretched thin like it took effort to exist at all. Remember. The call disconnected before I could react. I stood there, the hallway lights dimming automatically around me, aware of how quiet everything had become. My phone screen went dark. I didn't move. I didn't need to check the number again. I already knew it. Somewhere behind me, a door opened. A patient needed something. I turned toward the sound. My hand tightening around the phone without realizing it, my mind already working through explanations it didn't believe but wasn't ready to abandon. Work doesn't stop for words you can't explain, and neither do I. I didn't react the way people expect when something crosses a line like that. I didn't drop the phone. I didn't gasp. I didn't look around to see if anyone else had heard it. I stood still, listening to the empty space where the word had been letting my brain do what it always does under pressure, slow everything down and start sorting. Words don't come from nowhere. That was my first thought. Breathing maybe, static possibly, but words require intention, or at least a source. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and walked toward the nearest patient room because movement felt safer than standing still. The floor under my shoes felt solid. That mattered. Inside the room, a man in his late 80s slept with his mouth open, chest rising steadily. I checked his oxygen, adjusted the blanket, and watched his breathing long enough to confirm it was real and regular. That sound grounded me. Living lungs have a consistency that dying ones don't. I let myself focus on that difference longer than necessary. When I stepped back into the hallway, the building felt unchanged. Same low hum, same distant cough, same call lights waiting patiently to be answered. If something truly impossible had just happened, the world hadn't noticed. That was oddly reassuring. I told myself I would not check the call log again. I checked it anyway. Same number, same timestamp, no voicemail. Nothing to analyze beyond what I already knew. I locked the screen and slid the phone away, irritated at myself for expecting clarity from a piece of glass and plastic. The next night, the call didn't come. I noticed its absence immediately, which annoyed me. I didn't want a pattern. Patterns turn coincidences into problems. I went through my shift deliberately, making sure every action stayed rooted in routine. Meds at the right times. Notes entered correctly. Conversations kept short. If the phone stayed silent, that meant the previous night had been an outlier. I wanted that badly enough to believe it. At 2:13 a.m., my phone buzzed. The time mattered. Not midnight, not close. Random enough to feel unplanned. I answered without thinking, my thumb moving before my doubts caught up. The line was silent again. No breathing this time, no word. Just that open connection heavy in my ear. I didn't speak. I waited. The call lasted 12 seconds before disconnecting. I checked the hallway clock and then the phone as if one might explain the other. They didn't. I went back to work more unsettled by the inconsistency than the event itself. If something was going to happen, I wanted it to at least follow rules. Over the next week, the calls continued. Not every night, not even most nights. They showed up when I least expected them, slipping into shifts that had been quiet up until that point. Sometimes there was nothing but silence. Sometimes there was that faint, uneven sound I refused to label out loud. Once there was a word again, the same one, always the same, never louder, never clearer. I started writing things down, not in the chart. In a small notebook I kept in my locker for personal reminders, date, time, duration, sound or no sound. I didn't attach meaning to the entries. I treated them like data points. That felt safer than treating them like experiences. One thing became obvious quickly. The calls only came when I was working nights. That detail bothered me more than anything else. If this were a technical issue, it shouldn't care about my schedule. Phones don't track employment. They don't know when you're on shift. The idea that something could be waiting for me specifically was one I refused to entertain directly. I framed it differently. Coincidence shaped by perception, confirmation bias. Medical training is excellent at producing long explanations that end with the phrase statistically unlikely but possible. I considered telling someone, not a supervisor, not yet. I thought about mentioning it casually to another nurse, the way people float strange ideas to see how ridiculous they sound out loud. Every time I opened my mouth, the words felt wrong. Not because I was afraid of judgment, because once spoken, the situation would become something I couldn't manage alone. On the 8th night, I decided to test myself. When the phone buzzed at 11:36 p.m., I didn't answer. I let it ring until it stopped on its own. I watched the screen go dark and waited for the familiar release that comes with avoiding something uncomfortable. It didn't come. Instead, I felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with unfinished business. 2 minutes later, the phone buzzed again. I answered. Silence. Then breathing. Closer this time, clear enough that I didn't have to strain to hear it. My own breath caught in response, an automatic mirroring I didn't appreciate. I stepped into an empty supply room and closed the door more for privacy than safety. The sound continued, irregular, laboring, unmistakably human. I spoke before I could stop myself. Just one word. Hello. The breathing didn't change. It didn't stop. It didn't respond. It simply existed, filling the space between us with something that had no business being there. After 23 seconds, the line disconnected. I stood in that room longer than necessary, my hand still wrapped around the phone, my heart beating faster than it should have been. I wasn't scared, not exactly. Fear implies threat. This didn't feel threatening. It felt intentional, and that was worse. I checked the notebook later and added another line. Same number, same pattern. No explanation. That night, I dreamed of Rosemary for the first time since she died. She was sitting upright in bed, fully alert, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. She didn't speak. She just waited. I woke up before I could decide what that meant. The calls continued after that. Sporadic, controlled, always from the same number, always when I was alone enough to answer. I stopped checking the call log because it never changed. I stopped trying to convince myself it was nothing because that argument had run out of material. What unsettled me most was how easily the calls slipped into the rhythm of my nights. I found myself anticipating them without wanting to, listening for vibrations that weren't there, noticing the time more often. That's how things take root. Not through shock, but through repetition. One night as I passed the nurse's station, one of the aides glanced up at me and frowned. She asked if everything was okay. I told her I was fine. She nodded but didn't look convinced. Later, I realized she'd probably heard me talking on the phone in the hallway earlier, not arguing, not panicking, just speaking quietly into the dark. That realization stayed with me because if someone else had noticed, then whatever was happening wasn't confined to my head, and that meant I couldn't ignore it forever. I returned to my duties, answering call lights, adjusting medications, maintaining the version of myself that functioned without visible cracks. My phone stayed in my pocket, warm and heavy, like it was aware of being carried. At 11:54 p.m., it buzzed again. I didn't look at the screen this time. I already knew what it would show. I answered and weighted my grip. Steady, my breathing controlled my attention, focused in a way it hadn't been before. The sound on the line was quieter now, thinner, like it was taking effort to exist at all. I stayed on the call until it ended, standing in the middle of the hallway, listening to something that refused to be categorized, while the rest of the building carried on exactly as it always had. I lowered the phone slowly, not because the call had ended, but because my arm was starting to ache from holding it so still. When the screen finally went dark, I checked the time out of reflex. 11:54 p.m. Not midnight, not close enough to blame timing. Close enough to feel deliberate. I slipped the phone into my pocket and stood there for a few seconds, letting my breathing settle back into something normal. Whatever had just been on the line, it hadn't been random noise. I knew that now in a way that didn't require proof. The sound stayed with me as I walked, not echoing, not repeating, just present. Years in hospitals train your ears whether you want them trained or not. You learn to identify trouble before you see it, the difference between a cough that can wait and one that can't, the way oxygen sounds when it's just a little too low, the shift in breathing that tells you a body is running out of options. That sound on the phone matched something I'd heard too many times to mislabel. Cheney-Stokes respiration. I didn't say the term out loud. Naming things gives them weight, and I wasn't ready to carry that yet. But the pattern was unmistakable. Long pauses, shallow breaths. A rhythm that feels wrong even when you understand it clinically. It's the sound of a system failing in stages, not all at once. I'd heard it in emergency rooms, ICS and hospice rooms. I'd heard it the night Rosemary died. That realization tightened something in my chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. Fear is loud. This wasn't. This was quiet, intrusive, and oddly familiar, like hearing your own name spoken in a crowd you didn't know you were standing in. I forced myself back into routine, checked vitals, reviewed orders, answered a call light from a patient who needed help to the bathroom. The physical movement helped. Bodies are predictable when they're alive. They respond to assistance. They follow rules. I focused on that. The next call came 2 nights later during a stretch of shifts that had otherwise been uneventful. I was charting at the nurse's station when the vibration started. I didn't look at the screen right away. I picked up the phone, stood, and walked toward an empty hallway before answering. I don't know why I did that. Privacy maybe, or instinct. The breathing started immediately this time. No silence, no delay, just that uneven pattern filling my ear closer and clearer than before. I didn't end the call. I counted instead the way you do when you're assessing something that might turn into an emergency. 1, 2, 3. The pause stretched longer than it should have. Then a breath, shallow. Another pause, longer. The sound wasn't coming from a background source. It wasn't ambient. It was too focused for that. My own breathing slowed to match it without my permission. That bothered me. Mirroring is something you do with living patients unconsciously, aligning yourself with them to establish calm. I broke the pattern by stepping forward and forcing a breath through my nose, grounding myself in the feel of the floor beneath my shoes. I didn't speak. I didn't ask questions. I didn't say a name. The call ended on its own after 31 seconds. I wrote the details down later, my handwriting tighter than usual. Duration, sound present, no speech, pattern consistent. I stared at the words afterward, aware of how clinical they looked on paper. That was intentional. Emotion makes things slippery. Clinical language pins them down. I considered reporting the calls to IT, not as a mystery, as a technical issue. There are protocols for that, steps, checklists. It felt premature, though. I didn't want this to turn into something that required forms and meetings. I wanted an explanation that fit neatly into my existing understanding of how things work. Reporting it felt like admitting I didn't have one. The following night, I heard the sound again. Shorter this time, weaker. The breathing seemed to struggle like it was coming from farther away. I listened without moving my hands steady, my expression neutral in case anyone walked by. No one did. The call ended after 18 seconds. I realized something then that I hadn't wanted to acknowledge before. The sound was changing. It wasn't random. It wasn't looping. It was progressing. The way breathing does when a body is moving towards something irreversible. That thought lodged itself in my mind and refused to move. Progression implies direction. Direction implies intent. I didn't like where that line of thinking led. I finally mentioned the calls to a colleague the next morning, framing it carefully. I said I was getting strange silent calls during night shifts and asked if she'd ever experienced anything like that. She shrugged and said, "Phones do weird things in old buildings." Then she paused and asked if I'd been talking on the phone in the hallway late the other night. She'd heard my voice while she was passing the med room. Not the content, just the sound of someone speaking quietly into a phone. That confirmation hit harder than I expected. Not because it validated the calls, but because it confirmed I wasn't imagining my own behavior. I thanked her and changed the subject. I didn't tell her what I'd heard. Some things lose coherence when you try to share them too early. The calls continued, spaced just far enough apart that I couldn't anticipate them. Sometimes there was only breathing, sometimes silence, once nothing at all except the faintest hiss like air passing through something narrow. Each time the sound felt thinner, less certain. I found myself staying on the line longer, not out of curiosity, but because hanging up felt wrong, as if interrupting something mid-process. One night after a call ended, I stood alone in a supply closet and pressed my fingers into my palm hard enough to leave marks. Physical sensation has a way of pulling you back into the present. I needed that reminder. I needed to know I was here in a body that worked in a building that followed rules. I started sleeping less, not from nightmares, from listening. Even off shift, my phone stayed on volume up, placed where I could see it. I didn't tell myself I was waiting for it to ring. I told myself I was being responsible. If there was a problem, I wanted to catch it. That explanation sounded reasonable enough to let me keep going. During one of the calls, the breathing paused for so long that I thought it was over. The silence stretched. 10 seconds. 15. My muscles tensed, anticipating the end. Then faint and strained, a breath slipped through. I exhaled at the same time without realizing it. Relief came before confusion, and that disturbed me more than anything else had. I ended that call manually, not because I was afraid, but because I needed to reassert some kind of boundary. My thumb hovered over the screen for a second afterward, as if expecting resistance. There was none. I put the phone away and walked back into the hallway. My steps measured, my posture calm. A patient down the hall needed pain medication. Another needed repositioning. These were things I could address. Things with clear causes and effects. I focused on them, letting the night absorb my attention, piece by piece. Still, as I moved through the building, the sound followed me. Not audibly, in memory, in recognition, in the quiet certainty that I was hearing something I understood far too well to dismiss. I opened the IT request page at the nurse's station and stared at it longer than necessary. The cursor blinked in the empty description field, waiting for me to decide how much truth could survive being typed into a system designed for printer errors and login issues. I closed the page without submitting anything and logged into the call light records instead. If something was wrong, there would be data. Systems leave footprints even when people don't. The nurse call logs showed nothing unusual in Rosemary's room after the night she died. No manual activations, no sensor errors, no system resets outside the normal schedule. That was both reassuring and irritating. I preferred problems with visible causes. Invisible ones tend to migrate. I checked phone reception next. Willow Creek sits close enough to the hills that cell service fluctuates depending on weather and time of day. Dropped calls were common. Ghost calls less so, but not impossible. I made a note to myself and moved on, careful not to linger too long on any single explanation. Dwelling turns curiosity into obsession faster than most people realize. Later that night, I brought the issue to our IT technician in the most neutral way I could manage. I told him I was receiving repeated calls from a number that appeared disconnected and asked if there were any known routing issues with the local carrier. He shrugged, pulled up some diagnostic screens, and ran a few checks while explaining how call forwarding can occasionally misbehave in older buildings. His tone was casual, unconcerned. That helped more than the information itself. According to the system, the calls to my phone were real, incoming, logged by the carrier. Nothing indicated spoofing or internal routing. When I asked about outgoing records from Rosemary's number, he frowned slightly and said he couldn't see any recent activity on his end. The account appeared inactive, not suspended, just unused. That's not unusual, he said. People stop using phones all the time. I nodded and thanked him. I didn't tell him that the number kept calling me anyway. I tried reaching Michael again the following afternoon. He answered this time sounding distracted and tired. I told him I was checking in and asked casually what he'd done with his mother's phone after the funeral. He said it was in a drawer at his apartment turned off. He hadn't charged it, he hadn't touched it. I asked if he'd received any strange calls from it or if anyone else might have access to the device. He said no. His voice didn't change when he answered. There was no hesitation that suggested uncertainty. I apologized for bothering him and ended the call. I believed him. That was the problem. Back at work that night, I paid closer attention to the environment than usual, not looking for anything specific, just observing. The way the lights dimmed at exactly the same minute each hour, the way doors closed themselves when the HVAC kicked on, the subtle delays in call lights when the system refreshed. All normal, all predictable. Predictability is comforting until it isn't enough. The phone buzzed at 11:44 p.m. I didn't answer immediately. I watched the screen light up, memorizing the number of vibrations before it stopped. 4, same as the night before. I answered on the 5th vibration, not because I expected a difference, but because I wanted consistency on my end, if nothing else. Silence. I stayed on the line longer than usual, 30 seconds, 40. I watched the seconds tick by on the screen, letting the call exist without trying to control it. No breathing this time, no sound at all. It disconnected at 52 seconds. I checked the hallway clock and noted the time in my notebook. Data, just data. A nurse walked past me and glanced over. She asked if everything was okay. I told her yes and asked about one of her patients to redirect the conversation. She answered without pressing. People in hospice learn quickly what questions not to pursue. Later that night, I pulled up the hospital incident reporting system and hovered over the submit button. If I filed something, it would create a record. Records invite scrutiny. Scrutiny invites explanations that don't always align with reality. I closed the system again. I wasn't ready for that. The next morning, I called the phone carrier directly from my home. I explained that I was receiving calls from a number that should be inactive and asked if they could check for any anomalies. The representative was polite and thorough, running through a script that included SIM swaps, voicemail forwarding, and network lag. In the end, she told me the same thing IT had. The calls were logged as originating from Rosemary's number. No errors were flagged. From their perspective, everything was working as intended. That's not possible, I said before I could stop myself. She paused and asked if I wanted to escalate the issue. I declined. That night, I noticed something else. The calls were no longer random in their timing. They clustered around the same window, roughly between 11:30 and midnight. Not exactly. Close enough to matter. Close enough to suggest intent without confirming it. I didn't like that my mind kept framing it that way. During a lull, I reviewed Rosemary's chart again. Not for medical reasons, for context. Notes about her anxiety, her questions, her fixation on memory. I reread my own documentation from those nights looking for anything that might hint at suggestion or influence. I found nothing out of place. That should have reassured me. It didn't. The phone buzzed again while I was charting. I answered without moving from the station. Silence. Then faintly the sound returned, weaker than before, fragmented, as if whatever was producing it had less capacity now. I listened until the call ended and noted the duration, 20 seconds. I became aware of someone standing nearby. One of the aides was at the printer, glancing over at me with a curious expression. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The awareness that I wasn't completely alone with this anymore changed the weight of it. Shared experience doesn't always bring comfort. Sometimes it just removes plausible deniability. I finished the shift with a sense of narrowed focus. Tasks blurred into one another. My attention kept drifting back to the phone, to the notebook, to the quiet patterns forming around something that refused to declare itself. I didn't feel afraid. I felt challenged, as if the situation were testing how long I would insist on fitting it into a framework that no longer held. On my way out that morning, I paused by the nurse's station and looked at the incident reporting screen one last time. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The choice was already made. I was still looking for an explanation that didn't require me to change how I understood my job or myself. My phone buzzed in my hand as I reached the parking lot. I didn't answer. I looked at the screen, took a slow breath, and noted the time before slipping it back into my pocket and unlocking my car. I let the phone keep vibrating until it stopped. Then I slid it face down onto the passenger seat and drove home without turning on the radio. The road was empty, the kind of empty that makes you aware of every small sound your car makes. Tires on asphalt, the turn signal clicking, my own breathing. I didn't replay the call in my head. I didn't analyze it. I'd learned that forcing meaning too early only makes things louder. I needed distance first. Sleep didn't come easily, but not because I was afraid. My mind kept circling a single question instead of spinning out into 100 possibilities. Why this pattern? Not why the calls existed, but why they unfolded the way they did. In medicine, symptoms matter less than progression. Random things happen, directional things don't. By the time I returned to work the next night, I had decided to stop chasing technical explanations, not because they were wrong, but because they weren't answering the question that actually mattered. The calls weren't escalating in volume or frequency. They weren't disruptive in a chaotic way. They were focused, controlled, almost restrained. That didn't match malfunction. It matched purpose. I noticed it first in the gaps between calls. The silence wasn't empty. It felt intentional, like something waiting for the right conditions. That thought annoyed me. Waiting implies awareness, and awareness is not something doctors like to attribute to unexplained events. Still, the idea refused to leave once it arrived. I crossed paths with Michael 2 days later when he came by the hospice to pick up paperwork he delayed dealing with. He looked thinner than I remembered, his movements slightly rushed, like he didn't want to stay longer than necessary. We spoke in the hallway, the conversation polite and careful, both of us avoiding anything too heavy. Before he left, he hesitated and asked if I'd ever dreamed about his mother. The question caught me off guard. I asked what he meant, keeping my tone neutral. He told me he'd been having the same dream for several nights. Rosemary, sitting upright in bed, looking directly at him, not sick, not well, just present. She didn't speak, she just waited. He said it wasn't frightening, just persistent. I didn't tell him about my dream. I didn't tell him about the calls. Not yet. I asked him how he felt afterward. He shrugged and said unsettled. Like there was something he was supposed to do but couldn't remember what it was. He laughed it off, apologizing for oversharing, and left before I could respond. That conversation stayed with me longer than I expected. Dreams are common after loss. So are patterns when grief looks for structure. But grief usually fades or shifts. It doesn't coordinate. That night when my phone buzzed at 11:39 p.m., I didn't feel startled. I felt prepared. I answered immediately and listened. There was breathing, faint and strained, followed by a pause that lasted long enough to make my chest tighten. Then softly, a sound shaped itself into something recognizable. Not a word this time, a fragment, a syllable that didn't finish becoming anything else. I didn't interrupt it. I realized then that I'd been approaching the calls the wrong way. I'd been listening like a clinician, cataloging sounds and timing, searching for causes. But this wasn't behaving like a symptom. It was behaving like a message that didn't care whether I understood the mechanism behind it. I spoke without raising my voice. I didn't ask questions. I didn't explain. I said her name. Just that. Rosemary. The breathing paused. When it resumed, it was slower, thinner. I stayed silent, letting the space stretch without trying to fill it. After a few seconds, the line went quiet again. The call ended. I didn't feel relief. I felt something closer to clarity. The calls weren't asking for help. They weren't trying to scare me. They weren't repeating themselves to assert existence. They were circling something, approaching it gradually, like a conversation that had started before either participant knew how to finish it. I reviewed my notes later and noticed something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. Every call with sound happened after a shift where I'd spent time with patients talking about memory, about legacy, about being remembered. Those conversations are common in hospice, but I'd been unusually attentive lately, engaged in a way that went beyond professional obligation. I'd been listening more closely than usual, not just to patients, but to what they were afraid to say. Rosemary had been afraid of being erased, not dying, not pain, erasure. That fear doesn't end when the body does. It just loses its voice, unless something gives it one. I didn't know what that meant in practical terms. I knew what it didn't mean. It didn't mean I was in danger. It didn't mean something was trying to follow me home. It meant there was a need that hadn't been addressed. Needs don't disappear just because the context changes. The next call came later than usual, just after midnight. I was sitting alone in the break room staring at a cup of coffee I hadn't touched. I answered without hesitation. The sound on the line was barely there now, breathing reduced to effort. I listened and waited, resisting the urge to fill the silence. Then quietly the word returned, the same one as before. Remember. I didn't argue with it. I didn't correct it. I responded the way I would with any patient expressing fear. I acknowledged it. I said she was remembered, that she mattered, that she had left an impact. I didn't embellish. I didn't promise permanence. I stated what I knew to be true. The line stayed open for several seconds longer than usual. The breathing didn't resume. When the call ended, I sat there, phone still at my ear, aware of a shift I couldn't quite define. Not resolution, something closer to alignment. I didn't write that call down, not because it wasn't important, but because it didn't feel like data anymore. It felt like a conversation that had finally found the right direction. I went back to work answering call lights, adjusting medications, moving through the building with a steadiness I hadn't felt in weeks. Later, as I passed the nurse's station, one of the aides looked up and asked if I was okay. I nodded. She smiled and went back to her work. Nothing about me looked different. That mattered. The phone stayed quiet for the rest of the night. I noticed, but I didn't wait for it. I focused on the people in front of me, on the work that still needed doing. When the morning light crept in through the windows, I felt tired but grounded. Not relieved, not triumphant, just settled. As I gathered my things to leave, my phone buzzed once more. A single vibration, no number, no call, just a notification that disappeared as soon as I looked at it. I stared at the screen for a second, then turned it face down and picked up my bag. Some needs announce themselves loudly. Others take time to reveal what they're actually asking for. I didn't check the time when the phone started vibrating this time. I recognized the pattern before my mind caught up. The single short buzz, the brief pause, then the longer vibration that followed. My body reacted first, shoulders tightening, breath slowing. The hallway around me faded into background noise as I stepped into the empty family room and closed the door behind me. I answered without looking at the screen. For a moment, there was nothing, not even silence in the usual sense. Just the absence of sound, like the line itself was holding still. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. That wasn't how these calls worked anymore. Then the breathing came through thinner than it had ever been, fragmented, weak. Not labored this time, just diminished. It reminded me less of the final hours before death and more of the moments just before the body gives up trying altogether. The sound barely reached my ear, like it was traveling a long distance to get there. I stayed where I was, one hand resting against the back of a chair to keep myself grounded. I didn't count seconds. I didn't catalog patterns. I let the call exist without trying to shape it into something manageable. The breathing paused, longer than before, long enough that my chest tightened reflexively, as if I could will another breath through the line by needing it badly enough. When sound returned, it wasn't breathing. It was a voice, not clear, not steady, just a trace of sound shaped into something human. It took a moment for my brain to register it as speech at all. The volume was barely above nothing, the word dragged thin by effort. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, it wasn't even complete, forgotten. The word landed without force and without warning. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I closed my eyes for a moment, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I needed to remove every other distraction from the room. I spoke carefully, not as a doctor addressing a symptom, but as a person responding to fear. I said her name, slowly, clearly. I reminded her who she was, not in broad terms, but in specifics. A teacher. A woman who stayed late to help students who struggled. Someone whose presence had shaped other lives even if she never saw the full effect. I told her she was remembered. The line stayed open. No breathing followed. No sound at all. I kept talking, not filling space, but reinforcing what mattered. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't promise immortality. I told the truth as I understood it. That memory doesn't disappear just because the person it belongs to is gone. That impact doesn't vanish when the body stops functioning. The silence stretched heavy, but not empty. Then so quietly I almost missed it, another word slipped through. Shorter this time, softer. Thank you. The call disconnected. I didn't move. I didn't check the screen. I stayed where I was, my hands still wrapped around the phone, my breathing steady. There was no rush of relief, no sense of triumph, just a deep settling stillness that felt different from anything I'd experienced before. I opened the door and stepped back into the hallway. The building was unchanged. Call lights blinked patiently. A cart rolled somewhere in the distance. The night continued as if nothing unusual had happened, and in a way that felt right. Whatever had needed to be said had been said. The world didn't need to react to it. I went back to work. I checked on patients, adjusted pillows, administered medications, answered questions in low voices. The phone stayed in my pocket, silent and unremarkable. I didn't watch it. I didn't wait for it. The absence felt intentional, but I didn't dwell on that either. At one point, I caught my reflection in a dark window and noticed something I hadn't seen in weeks. I looked rested, not physically, but internally. The tension that had lived in my shoulders had eased without me realizing when it happened. I didn't write the call down, not because it wasn't important, but because documentation felt unnecessary. Some things don't benefit from being reduced to bullet points. This wasn't a phenomenon to track anymore. It was an exchange that had reached its natural end. Later that night, I crossed paths with Michael in the hallway. He was visiting another patient he'd befriended during his mother's stay. He looked up when he saw me and hesitated, then smiled in a way that felt genuine, not polite. He told me he hadn't dreamed about his mother in a few nights. He said it like an observation, not a relief. I nodded and told him that was okay. Dreams like grief change shape over time. He thanked me for taking care of her. I told him it had been my privilege. That wasn't a phrase I used lightly. It felt accurate. The rest of the shift passed without interruption. When morning came, it did so gradually, light creeping into the building without fanfare. I gathered my things and headed toward the exit, my phone still untouched in my pocket. Outside, the air was cool and clear. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, letting the quiet settle around me. I didn't feel watched. I didn't feel followed. I felt present. As I unlocked my car, my phone buzzed once. I froze, keys in hand, heart rate barely changing. I pulled the phone out and looked at the screen. No incoming call, no missed call. Just a notification from my calendar reminding me of a meeting scheduled later that week. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and slid into the driver's seat. The engine started without hesitation. The road home was empty. I drove away from the hospice with the same routine motions I'd followed for years, aware of how ordinary everything felt. Ordinary doesn't mean nothing happened. It means whatever did happen fit itself back into the world without demanding proof. The phone stayed quiet as I drove, resting on the passenger seat like it always had before any of this began. I noticed the silence before I trusted it. That was the first thing that changed. For weeks, my attention had been trained on absence and interruption, on vibrations and pauses and sounds that didn't belong. When the phone stayed quiet night after night, I didn't feel relief right away. I felt cautious. Silence in hospice work is rarely neutral. It usually means something is either about to happen or has already finished happening. The nights settled back into their usual rhythm: medication rounds, charting, quiet conversations at bedsides where people were still very much alive but already preparing to leave. I didn't check my phone as often. I stopped carrying it in my hand. It went back into my pocket where it had lived for most of my career without demanding attention. A week passed, then another. Nothing happened. No late night calls, no missed notifications, no vibrations that turned out to be nothing. The pattern didn't resume, it didn't shift, it simply stopped. That finality felt different from interruption, like a door closing instead of being held open. I didn't tell anyone at work that the calls had ended. There was no announcement to make, no closure meeting to attend. The absence didn't need witnesses. It just existed quietly the way most endings do in hospice. People imagine dramatic final moments. Most of the time, things end when no one is looking directly at them. Michael came by one afternoon with a folder tucked under his arm. He said he'd been going through his mother's things and found some old photos he wanted to share with the staff. He spoke easily without the edge of urgency he'd carried before. He told me he'd started telling stories about his mother again, not just to family, but to coworkers and friends who'd never met her. It surprised him how much lighter that felt. I listened without interrupting. That's a skill hospice teaches you early. When people find their footing again, they don't need guidance. They need space. He didn't mention dreams. I didn't ask. After he left, I stood at the nurse's station for a moment, looking at the spot where my phone usually rested during night shifts. It stayed dark, unremarkable, exactly what it was supposed to be. Something else had shifted too, though it took longer to articulate. I found myself paying closer attention when patients talked about being forgotten, not correcting them, not reassuring them too quickly, letting them sit with the fear long enough to name it properly. Fear loses some of its power once it's acknowledged accurately. I started asking different questions during admissions, not about symptoms or preferences, but about what people wanted remembered. Names, habits, stories, small details that would have seemed irrelevant to a medical chart, but mattered deeply to the person telling them. I didn't document those things officially. I remembered them. Other staff noticed the change. A nurse commented once that I spent more time sitting than standing during rounds. An aide joked that I turned into one of those doctors who actually listens. I smiled and let them tease me. They weren't wrong. Hospice work has a way of flattening big questions into manageable tasks. You can't solve death, so you focus on comfort. You can't promise meaning, so you provide presence. What I'd learned slowly and without planning to was that presence includes acknowledgement, not just of pain, but of fear that doesn't have a medical code. The phone stayed silent through all of it. I stopped carrying the notebook I'd used to track the calls. I didn't throw it away. I left it in my locker, forgotten, until one morning when I cleaned out old belongings and found it wedged behind a pair of shoes. I flipped through the pages once, noting the precision of the entries, dates, times, durations. It looked like someone else's handwriting, someone who'd needed structure more than understanding. I closed the notebook and put it back where I found it. There are still moments, usually late at night, when I pause before answering my phone. Old habits don't disappear overnight. They soften, fade, make room for something else. I don't expect it to ring the way it did before. I don't wait for it. But I remain open in a way I wasn't before. Other nurses have started sharing stories with me, not dramatic ones, small ones. A patient's tablet lighting up after death, a television turning on to a familiar channel, a call light activating without explanation. Things they'd previously brushed off as coincidence but now felt comfortable mentioning out loud. I don't interpret those stories for them. I don't explain them away either. I listen. Listening, it turns out, is often enough. I still don't know what caused the calls. I don't pretend to. I have theories the way anyone in medicine does. Stress, grief, technology behaving badly at inconvenient moments. The brain's remarkable ability to fill in gaps when meaning feels necessary. All of those explanations fit parts of what happened. None of them fit all of it. What I know for certain is simpler. Rosemary was afraid of being forgotten. That fear shaped her final days. It didn't disappear when her body stopped functioning. It found expression in the only way it could, through the one thing she associated with connection. A phone, a number, a line that stayed open long enough to be heard. When that fear was acknowledged directly and honestly, the calls stopped. I don't need that to mean anything more than it does. Death, after all, is not a single moment. It's a process, one that begins long before the body fails and continues in ways medicine doesn't always measure. Consciousness doesn't obey our categories. Memory doesn't follow biological rules. And the boundaries we draw between living and dying are more porous than we like to admit. I carry that awareness with me now quietly, the way you carry something fragile that doesn't need to be shown to be protected. When I sit with patients in their final hours, I listen for what they're really afraid of losing. Not just comfort, not just dignity, but recognition. Sometimes all someone needs is to know they mattered, that their presence left an impression, that their life registered somewhere beyond their own experience of it. The phone on my bedside table stays silent most nights. When it rings now, it's usually something ordinary. A reminder, a wrong number, a friend checking in. I answer it without hesitation, my pulse steady, my expectations reasonable. The hospice continues to function the way it always has. Patients arrive, patients leave, staff rotate, charts are opened and closed. From the outside, nothing about my work looks different. That's fine. Most meaningful changes don't announce themselves. I don't claim to have crossed any boundary between life and death. I don't claim to understand what happens after the body stops. What I understand better now is what happens before. The need to be seen, to be remembered, to leave some trace behind that says, I was here and I mattered. That understanding has changed how I practice medicine, not in dramatic ways, in quiet ones, in the questions I ask, in the time I'm willing to spend, in the way I sit with silence instead of rushing to fill it. The phone stopped ringing. The work didn't.